What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Now, wait a minute. It's music trivia time. Do you recognize that opening line from a popular song back in the 1960s? Can you remember the name of the group and the name of the song? Well, probably many of you can. It was the Beatles, the song "With a Little Help from My Friends." That was in 1967 from the Sgt. Pepper's album, and that was a popular song, and largely because not only was it fun, but it had an idea that most of us can resonate with, that as we go through life, oftentimes we benefit from the help of our friends. And what's true for us, I will say, is definitely true for the Apostle Paul. Hey, we're in a sermon series. We're talking about Troas. We're looking at Acts chapter 20, when Paul was on a journey, but he makes a stop at the port city of Troas and spent a week in Troas visiting with the church of Troas. Now, I described the church to you last week. I called it an ordinary church, and by that I meant it was settled and established into a routine as church. Earlier chapters in Acts, you're seeing Paul go to a place with no church at all. He evangelizes, he baptizes, he starts a church, and he teaches them how to become the church. But we're at a place now in the history of the church where we're getting several churches like Troas. They're settled, they're established, and as I described it last week, they're doing church the way church ought to be done. Now, that's important for us because here at First Church, we don't try to invent church anew today. We go back to the New Testament. We listen to what the apostles teach, what they teach us in their commands and instructions, but also what they taught the churches, how to do church, and we watch the practice and the pattern and learn from it. We're always trying to learn lessons about how to do church and do it the way it ought to be done as we go back to the churches in the New Testament, Troas being our case in point this month. So our text today is Acts chapter 20, verses 4 and 5. But I'll tell you right up front, verse 4 is a strained verse to try to get a sermon out of. It's a list of names. 7 names of 7 good friends of the Apostle Paul. Sopater and Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius and Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus, and names you by and large don't even know. And you might just read right past it. There's nothing to do with this verse except their names of people. And people have stories. If you read through the stories in the book of Acts, their names show up ever so often. You get to learn about these fellas. If you read Paul's epistles, he'll sometimes mention this guy or that guy, and he'll tell you something about them. And when we get done, there are stories behind these names, and those stories teach us lessons about how to do church the way church ought to be done. So yes, I'm going to take verse 4 as our text today, those 7 friends of Paul, and I'm going to tell you some lessons you and I can learn about doing church. I'm going to start with the idea of partnership. Partnership. Ministry in the church should be a partnership. Now let's go back. Paul and the book of Acts. Boy, those two belong together like hand in glove. We think of the one, we think of the other. Because the book of Acts, it's starring the Apostle Paul. He's center stage. Spotlight is on Paul and his missionary journeys. First journey, second journey, third journey. And the final journey to Rome to stand on trial. And all through the chapters of Acts, time and time again, it's Paul did this and Paul did that. But if you read the fine print, what you'll find is for all those things that Paul did in the book of Acts, it wasn't just Paul. He didn't operate alone. Paul always has friends with him, working with him. It's bigger than just the Apostle Paul. And you'll see that as you go through the stories. These 7 men are with Paul on his journey to Jerusalem. They're spending the week there in Troas. But those same 7 men and others like them often were with Paul in the stories and the ministry of Paul. And so, for example, you'll find on the first missionary journey, who was it? It was Paul and Barnabas and John Mark. The second missionary journey, it was Paul and Silas and Luke and Timothy. Yeah, Paul always has his friends with him, helping him in his ministry he does. He'll acknowledge that in his epistles. We think of the 13 epistles of Paul. Yeah, those are letters that came from Paul, but read the greetings, and you'll find many times it will be Paul plus someone else who sends the greeting. Like, for example, Paul and Timothy to whatever church they're writing. 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Or the book of Galatians. Paul and my brothers here with me to the churches of Galatia. Paul was very mindful that when he did ministry, it wasn't just him. He had others working with him as well. Or you can look at some other examples in Paul's speaking. He'll sometimes refer to his partners as my brothers who are with me. Or he'll call a name and he'll say, my co-worker, my fellow laborer. Or he may say, my son in the faith. He's like a son to me. You can see Paul using these terms to indicate the closeness that they work together. Because for Apostle Paul, ministry is a partnership. Now, when you think of ministry as a partnership, that's going to teach us a lesson today. If we're going to do church the way church ought to be done, then we need to see the ministry of our church as a partnership as we work together. Now, sometimes what we're aware of as we look around the church and see the activities that are going on, we see the few, the ones who are out front in the lead. But I want you to understand that around here, when things get done, it's because of many hands working together. That's the way it always is for us. Many hands working together, not just a few of us getting the job done. So, for example, we sometimes give a lot more attention to the spotlight people, like the preacher who gets his time up on stage, and the associate ministers who spend their time working on this task and that task. Oftentimes we've got our spotlight people, but we'll tell you we don't do all the work around here. We don't even do close to half of it. No, there's a lot of different people busy doing things around here, and if it wasn't for them, I don't know how the job would get done. It's always many hands working together to get the job done. It's a partnership in ministry. Now, that's why here at First Church, we take that as one of the lessons we learned from the early church, and it's a strong value for us. You'll hear me say it. You'll hear others say it as well. We encourage you to get involved. Everybody needs to be doing something here. And so let me remind you of something we should always keep in mind. We want everyone contributing, and every effort valued, and every success shared. Now think about that. That makes sense. Everyone contributing. We want all the members of the church getting involved somewhere. Find something to do. And we put those opportunities out there. For example, Man of Ministry. We say, show up on this second Saturday of the month. We need a lot of hands. Let's get the truck unloaded, get food ready to distribute. And it's a great service that many people can get involved and do. We put up the advertisement. We need volunteers for Vacation Bible School. We got a whole bunch of you volunteer. Some of you might be thinking, well, I wish I had. I should have. Just go talk to Timmy. Maybe there's still room for you. You get the idea. We're always putting opportunities out there, and we'll ask you to come get involved, and everybody should get involved. And then whatever you do, whether it's a big task or a small task, doesn't matter. Every effort is valued. We see everyone contributing to the cause of the church and the cause of Christ. And, of course, any victory we have, any success, we share it together as a church. That's the idea of partnership in ministry. It's one of the lessons we learn from these 7 friends of Paul there at Troas. Let me give you a second direction we're going to go in our thinking, and that is leadership. Look at these 7 men, and I'm thinking of leadership. Now, let me back up and give you the background behind these 7 men, these names that are put here in Acts 20, verse 4. These 7 men apparently were converts from the mission work of the Apostle Paul. They become Christians on the mission field. First, we look at their 7 names. Those are Greek Roman names. That's not Jewish names. We don't think they came from way back where Paul came from. No. In fact, as their town of origin is identified here and in other places in the New Testament, we find they're from the very churches where Paul went in and there was nothing, and he preached the gospel, he evangelized, he baptized, he planted churches, and they're from those churches. And so, for example, some of them are from Asia Minor, what we today call Turkey. Well, for example, one from Lystra, Paul preached there. Derbe, Paul preached there. Ephesus, Paul spent a lot of time preaching there. Some are from over in Macedonia, what we today call Greece. It mentions Berea, Paul preached there. Thessalonica, Paul preached there. You see, these fellows, they heard the gospel. And they became Christians. They became believers, but more than just believers. They became believers and evangelists. You see, they decided to take the good news they received, the salvation that came through Jesus Christ. They wanted to tell others and do it in a very strong and powerful way. So these 7 and others like them, they followed Paul on his mission work. They went with him, and along the way they learned how to be an evangelist of the gospel, how to be a preacher of the word. And so Paul showed them, he taught them, he mentored them, and gave them opportunities to exercise their gift. Yeah, these fellows, they did a lot of preaching with Paul. And when you read the stories in the book of Acts or read the epistles as Paul speaks about what happened, here's what you'll find. Paul will come into a town ready to preach the gospel. He doesn't do it all by himself. He's got other preachers with him, and they can really get the gospel out there throughout the city. Or sometimes Paul will start a church, and then he's ready to move on to another location, and he'll leave behind, and it names who he left behind. Keep the work going here as he moves on. Sometimes they're looking ahead, and Paul will say, I'm going to go over here to this town. You go to that one, and they'll split up. We'll get back together again. And Paul used these fellows in a powerful way to get his mission accomplished because it was a partnership. And it was leaders that he had trained who were going to help him in that partnership. And so, yeah, they're doing a lot of preaching, a lot of evangelizing. And what we find is as they continue to grow and develop and become like Paul, they became leaders of the church like Paul. Take young Timothy. Timothy's one of those fellows that Paul took him in and took him with him and trained him and nurtured him and developed him. And then when Paul was doing his ministry at Ephesus, Paul gets ready to go on somewhere else. He left Timothy in Ephesus. He reminds us in 1 Timothy chapter 1. And read that epistle, and he tells Timothy, let me remind you once again the work you need to do there as you become their preacher and a leader within their church. And all of these fellows had a similar story. Now, some of their stories recorded in the New Testament. A lot of their stories we get from history, as the stories of these fellows are told by the Christians in the generations to come. And as you look at the history of all 7, here's what you'll find. Every one of them eventually going off in their direction, being just like Paul, doing a ministry of the word, leading the churches where they were. We know about their deaths because most of them became martyrs. They died under persecution. And we know that the church looked at them and honored them as leaders of the early church. I've seen a lesson here for us today, and that is this. If we're going to do church the way church ought to be done, we've got to have some good leaders within the church. We always need good leaders. Now, I know I just emphasized everybody getting involved, the many hands working together to get the work of the church done. And we do need that. We need the many hands for the variety of tasks that we do in the church. But for all of those tasks and the teams that are doing them, somebody's got to take the lead. If you want to get a job done, you've got to have the team that's going to do it, but somebody who's a good leader to guide that team in getting the job done. And so the church always needs good leadership. Now, I'm going to give you a takeaway here, and that is this. First, I want you to appreciate those who lead us. Here at First Church, I'm surrounded by a lot of good leaders, and I appreciate the leaders. I hope you do as well. I work with a great team, for example, with my elders, 7 elders, and my deacons, 7 deacons. Together, we work as a great team, plus I watch each one of them go off and do their individual ministry and service here at the church. I've got 2 good associates I work with, and I enjoy working with them because they get a lot of good things done. But in addition to that, I've got the good office staff that I have that really covers a lot of the work here. We've got teachers and leaders in the very small groups we have in the Sunday school classes, not to mention all those youth sponsors and children's workers and those who take care of food, those who take care of some of our bereavement needs when we have a death in the church family, and on and on and on. We've got a lot of people out there, the many hands working, but always somebody who's taken a lead. And there's a lot of different leaders at different levels in this church. I appreciate them all. I hope you appreciate the good leadership we have here at First Church. But not just appreciate the good leaders, but also step up when called. You know, there are going to be times we might come to you and we may say, we would like to ask you, would you step up and lead this, whatever this may be? It may be a big job, maybe a small job, doesn't matter. Every job needs somebody to lead the team that's going to do it, and we might call upon you. I hope you'll be ready for that. I hope you'll think, yeah, they think I can do it, I'm going to do it. Now, don't ever imagine that the reason we're asking you is because we tried all the people we wanted and we couldn't find them, we're going to settle for you. No, if we ask, it's because we think you can do it. Now, let's give it a try and let's see if you can, and we're going to encourage you and support you. Yeah, if we're going to have good leadership in the church, we got people who will step up when they're called upon to lead the ministry and service we have. Boy, you put that together, leadership and partnership, you've got a great combination. Many people working together for the cause, with some being the leaders of those efforts, and all of that together, we can do church the way church is supposed to be done. But there is one more lesson I get from these 7 friends of Paul, and that's because they are, in fact, friends, and that's the idea of fellowship. I mentioned fellowship because as I look at these 7 guys, they are more than just simply guys who work together on a job. They have spent so much time working together, they have become friends. Friends with each other and friends with the Apostle Paul, the one that's leading them. And I want to develop that idea of their good friendship. I see it so clearly. I see it when Paul talks about them in his epistles. Paul will, for example, speak of them as my brothers. He'll speak of them as my dear friend. He'll even speak of, that's my son in the faith. He's like a son to me. He uses terms of affection to describe these fellows because they've become good friends. Well, you can't help it if you're going to spend some time together. It's natural to become good friends. Now, they're the really good friends because they're the kind of good friends who are there through thick and thin. You know that expression, someone who's there in thick and thin. It's the idea of someone's there for the good times, but then they don't bail on you when the tough times come. They're still going to be there to encourage and support you. And these are those kind of fellows. I know that because I see their stories. You read in the book of Acts, you watch Paul, and Paul is always running into trouble. Preaching the gospel, not everybody wanted to hear that. So he always had opposition and persecution. There'd be those with the verbal opposition. Sometimes they picked up stones. They'd beat him with sticks and whips. And there were times he got put in a jail over here or a jail over there. There were always times where Paul was running into trouble. Now, we associate those troubles with Paul and his ministry, but read carefully. Paul always has friends with him doing his ministry as a partnership, and they're often in the midst of those troubles as well. Many of them will be in those situations. Take, for example, 2 in our list, Aristarchus and Gaius. They were there at Ephesus when Paul's ministry got to a point where the opposition turned a riot loose in the city. They gathered in the theater yelling, "Great is Diana," and they wanted to find out, where is this guy that caused all the trouble? Let's get rid of him. They sent a team to find Paul to bring him back to the theater. Now, they couldn't find Paul, but they did spot 2 of his associates who worked with him. They grabbed Aristarchus and Gaius, and Acts says, dragged them into the theater. Those guys, their life was put on the line because they were friends and partners with Paul. Now, they survived that. You might think they might have decided to keep a little distance from Paul. He's trouble. Oh, no. They're here with him right now. Acts chapter 20. They're in Troas for a week. They're heading with him to Jerusalem. Yeah, they were good friends, and they stuck with Paul, good and bad. Aristarchus in particular, boy, he went through a lot of things for Paul, his friend. He not only was there at Ephesus when they couldn't find Paul and being threatened for his life. Colossians chapter 4, Paul mentions that the 2 of them spent some time in jail together. Also, he's the one that will be with Paul when Paul's arrested in Jerusalem, put in chains, and then he's on a ship headed towards a Roman court, and you could take a friend with you, and Aristarchus went with him. And when the shipwreck happened and they had to swim to shore, it was Paul and Aristarchus swimming to shore. These fellows stuck with Paul, just like they stuck with Jesus Christ. And in the good times and the bad times, they didn't bail. They didn't give up, because that's what good friends do. They stay together in thick or thin. That's what the church needs. If the church is going to do church the way church ought to be done, we've got to have some good fellowship within the church, some good friendships that are built as we work together for the cause of Christ. You go back to Acts chapter 2 when the church is just beginning, day of Pentecost. Luke mentions in Acts 2:42, he mentions some of the key things the church was committed to from day one. They'll develop later over time, but from day one, these were important. What was it? They continued steadfastly. First, in the apostles' teaching. Well, I spoke about that last week. What the apostles taught, what they believed, what they practiced. Boy, they were committed to that. But it goes on to name some more things, and the very next thing, fellowship. They continued steadfastly in fellowship. That was an important thing for the early church, that we come together, and not just simply so we can be in a program, so we can be in an activity, so we can get some jobs done, but to develop friendships. They were spending time together, getting to know one another, and building a bond of friendship. and a bond of friendship that is so strong that it will hold in thick or thin. You know, I think we got that kind of thing going on here. You surely have observed it, because I've certainly seen it and been part of it. We have that kind of friendship that develops here at First Church for those who stay here long enough and get involved in the people's lives. And you'll see it as we, for example, we celebrate the good times that happen. It could be, for example, an engagement that was announced, and we're all curious about that, or a new birth of a child, and everybody likes to take a turn to hold the baby. We celebrate the good times, and we're there in the tough times as well. You'll see that when there's a death within our church family, a lot of people making their calls, expressing their sympathy. You'll see it when there's the hospital time. And sometimes Ray will grab me, and we'll run to the hospital or run to the home. We're not the first ones there. Somebody already got there ahead of us, and many come afterwards. You'll see it when we have someone who's dealing with a medical crisis in their life, an issue that they're waiting for results, or a cancer. They know what they've got, and we're all giving our sympathy and our support, asking the question, have you heard the latest, any updates? You know, you've probably observed the way there are so many people in this church who have a strong bond of fellowship and friendship, that they're invested in each other's lives. Now, maybe you're observing it, though, from the sidelines, saying, yeah, it's not really something I see happen around me. I see everybody else doing it. Maybe it's time that you got involved in the fellowship. Maybe you need to get deeper in the fellowship yourself, so you can be part of this great experience of what it means to be church. How do you do that? Number one, invest your time. Don't just show up and then go home, but invest time in the gathering of the saints. Get here early so you can do a little bit of socializing and fellowship. Stay around just a little bit and linger a bit and talk. And then show up for the other activities we do. Because you'll notice when I announce it, a lot of the things I say we're doing on our calendar, I always encourage it's a great time of fellowship. Manna Ministry on Saturday. Oh, it's a great time to serve, but also as we come together, we spend a lot of time in fellowship. We enjoy just being together. Or even in Vacation Bible School. Oh, yeah, you're there to work, but you're going to work alongside someone through the week, and as you do, you get to know them more. There's fellowship involved in this as well. Wednesday nights, fellowship meal. Oh, you could eat at home, but here you get fellowship with it. And then the Bible studies and the time of fellowship before and after. We're always looking for the opportunities for fellowship. And what it means is you got to invest some time, and the fellowship will grow. Also, encourage everyone. Paul said, greet everyone with a holy kiss. And whether you do a kiss or not, the idea is as you walk through the halls of our church, speak to people. Speak here, speak there, acknowledge, say hello. I don't know your name. Here's my name. And as you do that on a regular basis, you'll start to feel the bond of fellowship growing. And also, as you meet on the street, you want to greet. You'll see First Church people all around town. We're a small town. You run into them at the grocery stores, at the restaurants. Always take the time to say hello. I don't even know your name, but I know you go to same church I go to, and you want to do that. And then I encourage you to develop some friendships. That is, you need to have your special friends here, the ones you spend more time talking to, maybe because you sit near each other or what other interests you have in common. And as you continue to spend a little bit of extra time with them, even as you're greeting everyone else, that extra time with them grows into a deeper fellowship. It's part of getting into the fellowship of the church. Oh, I'll tell you one more thing. Make it your church. That is, make First Church your church, and not just the church I go to. Now, one way you can do that, of course, is by placing your membership here. That is, if you are an immersed believer, in your past at some point, you put your faith in Jesus Christ, and you chose to be buried in the waters of baptism and raised. That's the only requirement we have for being a member here. So once you talk to me, talk to one of the associates, talk to one of the elders and say, you know, I'd like to do that. I'd like to place my membership. By doing so, you're taking one further step in making this your church and getting deeper into the fellowship of this church. Also, when you talk about First Church, make sure you talk about it as your church. Not just what they do at First Church, but what we do at our church. And once you come, if you don't have a church, why don't you come with me to my church? The more we do those kind of things, the more we're making it our church and deepening the fellowship we have in this church. You know, I look at these 7 men. It's just names and a list. It's more than that. It's stories, and stories that teach us about partnership in ministry, about the leadership we need in the ministries we do in the church, and about the fellowship that develops a friendship bond that holds us together as the church. And when we do those kind of things, when we're truly learning a lesson from the church of Troas and from these good friends of the Apostle Paul. Father, we thank you. We thank you for the lessons we learned from Scriptures about how to do the church and do it right. I pray we will learn those lessons and practice them so that we can be the church that you want us to be in this community. We thank you. We pray. In Jesus' name, amen.